delighted to welcome you all to this very important event by the UK BME Anti-Slavery Network, known as BASNET. So for those of you who are not aware of BASNET, we are a part of the charity called Africa Safeguarding Children. And our mission is to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in the UK modern slavery space. You can read more about BASNET on our work and our activities on our website at www.bmeantislavery.org. And just a very quick introduction, I'm Debbie Ario. I'm the founder and CEO of the charity Africa Safeguarding Children, and I'm also the chair of the UK BME Anti-Slavery Network, BASNET. And so this event has been organized by BASNET as part of our activities to mark Anti-Slavery Month. So October is Anti-Slavery Month. Today's event is an important one, which has been inspired by the first successfully prosecuted organ trafficking case in the UK earlier this year. So for those of you who are not aware, in May 2023, a Nigerian senator and his accomplices were convicted of trafficking a young Nigerian man into the UK for the purposes of harvesting his organs, his kidney, and transplanting his kidney into the senator's daughter's body. I mean, that's as best as I can explain it, right? The senator's daughter had a serious kidney problem at this time and required urgent transplant. So rather than wait for her turn on the kidney transplant list, our father decided it would be best to harvest someone else's kidneys for his daughter's benefits. So now, even though the issue of organ transplant or organ trafficking or organ harvesting or organ trafficking is done in other parts of the world, here in the UK, this will be the first time such a subject will come to the fore. I haven't said that this will be the first time it will occur. I said this will be the first time it will come to the fore because it is possible that there have been other cases that never came to the attention of the authorities. Therefore, for those of us working in the anti-trafficking and anti-slavery sector, this case was quite a revelation in regards to the growing problem of modern slavery in the UK. So for this reason, this event by BASNET could not be more urgent. At this event, we will explore this important aspect of modern slavery, not often covered nor discussed, and which is often a critical factor in the trafficking of people within and across borders. For us at BASNET, we also view organ trafficking as a race issue, targeting vulnerable migrants on the move or individuals from poor third world countries like Nigeria, China, and so on and so forth. So trafficking is not a Western problem. It is a third world problem. It is a race problem. It is a poverty problem. And therefore, there is an urgency of raising awareness to promote positive action by many key players in our sector, in government and internationally. So to help address this critical issue, I'm really, really delighted that we have 5 confirmed speakers, and I'm really pleased that they're able to sacrifice the time and effort to be here with us this morning. So we have 5 confirmed speakers. We have Mr. Godwin Morka, who is an expert from Nigeria. We have Joe Turner, who is an academic from University of West London. We have Dr. Sean Columb, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool. We have Eleanor Stephenson, who is a barrister and also is very much involved in a charity working to tackle organ transplant. And of course, we have Iain, who is an officer from the London Metropolitan Police. I'm going to introduce everybody properly shortly, just a very brief introduction. So we have these speakers from different backgrounds, research, academia, law enforcement, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to invite each speaker to present their paper on the relevant subject for 20 minutes each. And after that, we will open up the session for discussions, comments, questions, and answers from the audience. And I can see we still have more people joining us. We had over 150 people who actually registered for this event. So I think we might hit very close to that number as time goes on. If anybody has any questions, any comments at this stage, it would be nice to have that. I'll see what's in the chat box if anybody's asking any questions or anything. If not, if we're all okay, everybody's fine with the timing. We have 20 minutes per speakers, and after that we'll open the floor for anybody in the audience, to make any comments or ask any questions that they might have to any of our speakers. So if we're all ready, then I'm very pleased to invite our first speaker. Mr. Godwin Morka is an expert. He's a very, very well-known expert on human trafficking in Nigeria. We've worked with him for over 20 years in our work at Africa, in terms of addressing lots of different issues between Nigeria and the UK. He's going to deliver his paper exploring organ trafficking in Nigeria and across Africa. He is an independent consultant with more than 18 years experience in law enforcement, human trafficking, migration, child protection, policy development, training, and strategy. He is a retired Director of Research and Program Development at the Nigerian National Agency for the Prohibition of Trafficking in Persons, popularly known as NAPTIP. He's very skilled in nonprofit organizations, government, data analysis, strategic planning, and organizational development. So Godwin, you have the floor for the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and good morning to all the panelists and participants. It's an honor to collaborate with Africa once again after so many collaborations. It's good to see you again, Debbie, and thank you for the good work you are doing.
Thank you.
Yes, so I'm looking at the issue of organ harvesting in Nigeria, and especially Nigeria and West Africa. And I would like to say that organ harvesting is something that's been with us, but it's like a hidden phenomenon, or I may say hidden crime. Again, that is lost in our myths, in our culture, traditions, such that it's difficult for people to really understand what it's all about. In Nigeria, we have this notion that body parts can be used to make money or to create fortune for people. So we have this, the traditional African kind of religious thinking and ethos, thinking that, well, somebody may use somebody else's heart or some body part to be able to make money. But so you now find that in our modern times, we have so many cases of mutilated corpses, maybe bodies found on the streets, and with no head. In some cases, body parts are mutilated, especially the genitalia. Sometimes the kidneys, the heart, the lungs, and so on. And usually, the police will say it's ritual murder. They just call it ritual murder, and that covers everything. And usually, when they say it is ritual murder, that's the end of the story. Nobody actually argues with them. They just believe that that's it, and the case is closed. But occurrences, a few occurrences in the recent times have opened our eyes to the fact that there is more to it than just ritual murder. Nimado, if you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just as a general intro, saying that human trafficking, because again, organ harvesting is one of the purposes of trafficking. If you look at the definition, Palermo definition of trafficking, it talks about removal of organs. So it's a global phenomenon that is still spreading despite the best efforts of everyone, including Africa. Under labor trafficking, there's a lot of exploitative conditions that are imposed on them, on the victims, and sometimes some of them end up getting killed. Especially in recent times, when we started finding about Nigerians being trafficked to the Middle East for domestic work, looking all squeaky clean and legal, but when they get there, they find out that the The conditions of service are totally different. Some of them are subjected to about 18 to 20 hours work per day, and then subjected to sexual slavery. And of course, when they are killed, there is no questions asked because of this Middle Eastern notion that your slave is your property. And so we find that a lot of things like that happen. Sometimes when they get injured, they just drop them at the embassy, or they're never found. And organ harvesting is illegal removal of organs from people without their consent. Like Debbie tried to make the distinction. Of course, there is organ transplant, which is normal medical procedure done ethically and legally. But what we're talking about is the removal of organs from people without their consent. Just like the Kurimado thing came up, the boy was deceived, thinking that he was going to do something else, only to find that it was his organ they were aiming at. Usually for transplantation or commercial sale, through fraud, adoption, or deception. So that is actually what we are discussing. So it's called organ trafficking, and it's called organ harvesting. And I want to also say that beyond the trafficking of organs, there's also the trafficking of or illicit harvesting of human cells and tissues, apart from the well-known organs, because sometimes we're looking at things like the ova of a female or some other tissues, sometimes whatever it is, but the organs are usually used as generic terms to cover all these things. But really, we still have the illicit traffic of human tissues and human cells. Next slide, please. So, organ trafficking is a growing concern in North and West Africa, particularly in communities among displaced populations. I deliberately brought in North Africa here because that is actually where most of our people pass through. Black Africans pass through to go to try to get to Europe, and so they are stranded in places like Niger, Libya, some in Morocco, Algeria, and so on. And they are subjected to all kinds of terrible experiences, including organ harvesting, as we'll see later. So it is not about shortage of organs, but it's actually intertwined with structural, socioeconomic, and political issues. It's linked to transplant tourism, migration, exploitation of organ transportation. Now you talk about transplant tourism, and usually transplant tourism is supposed to take place that is people from the north coming to the global south for transplant. But like you saw in Kurimadu's case, it was going from Nigeria to the UK and all that. So transplant tourism is becoming a global thing too. Interregional trafficking is also common within Africa. That means in sub-Saharan Africa. And so next slide, so I can move fast. Thank you. So the US, the first legislation I could find that talked about organ transplant, because we don't have a specific legislation against organ transplant in Nigeria or in West Africa. But the US National Organ Transplant Act of 1984 defines organs as human organs and subparts thereof, including organs derived from fetuses. And it created the framework for organ transplant system to make it legal to transplant organs in America, how it should be done ethically. Then the Nigerian Trafficking Act, called the Trafficking in Persons Prohibition, Enforcement and Administration Act of 2015, prohibits the trafficking of or recruitment of persons for illicit organ harvesting. The law prescribes severe penalties, including imprisonment for up to 7 years and substantial fines, about 5 million naira, for those involved in organ trafficking or removal of organs. It provides stricter penalties for recruitment, transportation, accommodation of individuals under 18 years for organ removal. The global scale, let's just look at the context in which we are speaking. The global scale of organ trafficking is distressing. It's a distressing reality with statistics and data shedding light on the magnitude of this issue. While it's challenging to obtain precise numbers due to the clandestine nature of this crime, available information underscores the gravity of the problem. The US National Center for Biotechnology Information estimates that about 10% of all organ transplants globally, that's about 12,000 organs, are performed through illegal means. involving trafficked or commercialized organs, generating about $1.5 billion each year. Countries most affected, when we say organ trafficking affects countries across the world, but some regions are particularly vulnerable. North and West Africa, for example, are hotspots for organ trafficking, with impoverished communities and displaced populations at greater risk. Egypt and Libya have been identified as major organ trafficking areas where kidnapping and murder of individuals for organ harvesting occur. Patients from Israel, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the US, and some European countries are often the recipients of trafficked organs. Black market value of organs varies depending on the organ type and the demand-supply dynamics. In 2018, alleged alert by the UN revealed some staggering prices in the Middle East, such as $262,000 for a kidney, $120,000 for a heart, $157 for a liver, and then say these higher prices highlight the financial incentives for that drive organ harvesting, making it a very lucrative crime or criminal enterprise. These statistics and data provide a glimpse into the global reach and financial dimensions of organ harvesting, emphasizing the urgent need for international cooperation and comprehensive solutions to combat this crime. Now, looking at Nigeria, organ harvesting in Nigeria and West Africa sub-region is shrouded in mystery, mystic, and superstition. The mass media daily report cases of persons that are killed and found with missing organs, hearts, genitals, eyes, kidneys, and all that. Nigeria police would generally label such incidents as cases of ritual murder, and the cases are closed without much attempt to further investigate. Security authorities in Nigeria at Nigeria international airports also report incidences of human organs being exported with unverified medical reports. They said every day they have organs put on ice in food coolers being transported abroad. They just wave some kind of medical report and then they're allowed to pass. Nigeria also has a very large coastline stretching from Calabar to Badagry, very large Atlantic coast. And a lot of illicit trade, including the trade in human organs, are transacted using light boats to supply ships anchored offshore. And Nigeria is notorious for this issue of oil bunkering, where light boats are used to transport stolen crude and then sent to the mothership offshore. Now, we also know that there are a lot of other things also smuggled or stolen out of Nigeria, including human organs. Nigeria also boasts a large number of private jets and aircraft that are usually not subjected to much scrutiny. So most of our international airports or airports, you see there are hangars for just private jets. Sometimes you see about 15, 20 private jets on ground at some airports, and they just fly it about, including out of the country, without much scrutiny. About 2 or 3 years ago, a prominent Nigerian cried out that his aircraft was searched on arrival, and that could sound surprising to some people, but that tells you that they could just come and go as they like, carry whatever they like on their aircraft, and that's exactly what is going on. And of course, we have a lot of incidences of foreigners coming in with such private jets and going away with Nigerian gold. And of course, we also believe Nigerian illicitly harvested organs. There are many cases of the illicit harvest of human organs, tissues, and cells in Nigerian medical establishments. In 2015, NAPTIP discovered cases of students of Benue State University selling their organs, their ova or eggs, for 150 naira per 7 to enable them purchase then iPhones. That was the craze. They wanted iPhones, so they donated their eggs. And then recently we found out that this practice has spread to so many other universities and other tertiary institutions in Nigeria, and that the price has dropped now to about 50,000 naira per 7. Unfortunately, many girls donate their ova on 3 or more occasions, and medical practitioners have told us that when they do such things, they are likely to not to be able to have children by the time they are ready to settle down and marry. There are also reports of fertility or other unregistered centers inducing girls to get pregnant. I started with, girls were distressed, they got pregnant, maybe teenagers, secondary school girls, they try to give them succum, and then they harvest Well, sometimes they harvest the baby. Now we find them actually harvesting, inducing abortion in the third trimester and getting out the fetuses in order to harvest their stem cells. And they do that. In fact, it's becoming a kind of epidemic all over the place. And then corruption and organized crime. The organized crime groups are becoming involved in this. And of course, there's a lot of corruption within the healthcare system, which facilitates organ harvesting. So traffickers exploit their networks to move organs across borders and avoid detection because they have the reach, they have the means, they have the incentive because of the high profit and high turnover. In 2020, the Nigerian police reported the case of an Indian company that usually rewarded outstanding workers with a month-long trip to India. Somehow, each of the beneficiaries ended up in hospital with cases of appendicitis and were operated upon. Due to incessant complaints by one of them, the victim was examined in the Nigerian hospital and it was discovered that he was missing one kidney. All the others who had traveled to India were examined with the same result. In June 2023, the Lagos State University Teaching Hospital, LASUT, denied complicity in the disappearance of the intestines of a 13-year-old boy who had undergone reconstructive surgery, and the poor child later died. In August 2023, Dr. Noah Kekere was arrested by the Plateau State Police for illegally harvesting the kidney of one Mrs. Kehinde Kamal, causing her excruciating pains for 5 years before it was discovered. This lady went for appendectomy, and the doctor, under the cover of medical liberty, harvested her kidney. And without giving, of course, if you donate a kidney, there are certain things you can no longer do. But there was no such caution because the woman didn't even know her kidney was gone. It was 5 years later that it was discovered that the kidney had been harvested a while ago. The Nigerian Medical Association and Council just disowned the man and said they had revoked his license. Corruption and organized crime. The involvement of organized crime groups, corruption within the healthcare system can facilitate organ trafficking. And then let me also talk about in 2021, the then Director General of NAPTIP, Senator Bashir, stated that the presence of human farms in Libya, where regular migrants trying to get to Europe were detained and the organs harvested for sale. Let me say this is one of the things that, one of the sad outcomes or unintended outcome of European policy of arming the Libyan coast guards to actually detain or seize ships and prevent them from crossing over to Europe. What happens is that most of the time when they bring back those ships, the occupants are then detained in very horrible conditions. And some of them are now subjected to horrible labor, farm work, all kinds of work. In fact, they chain them underground. And then it was now discovered that some of them are actually kept in what they call human farms. They keep them, and when somebody needs a kidney, they'll take until the person dies. And it is real. And that was a report that happened, that was discovered in Libya in 2021. So, and you now find out that, okay, I also said, okay, fine, sorry. Section 20 of the Nigerian Trafficking Act prescribes imprisonment of up to 7 years and a fine of 5 million for removal, buying, involvement in sale of organs. Weak law enforcement and corruption create loopholes for criminal networks and corrupt officials. Nigeria police is notorious for not properly investigating cases of ritual murder, even when circumstances so demand. A young woman left Lagos to Ota in Ogun State on a Sunday morning in 2021 to see a herbalist. She was drugged and taken to a bush where 3 herbalists shared her body parts. One took the heart, another took her kidneys, while the third harvested her lungs. All these parts were put on ice in coolers, yet police did not further investigate. The problem is compounded because the police usually assumes investigative powers in such cases and do not allow NAPTIP to enforce the provisions of this act. Next, please. Now, the links with international organized crime. Egyptian trafficking syndicates are a major player in the organized trafficking network, operating from Egypt and collaborating with brokers in Libya and Sudan. Libya and Sudan are bottlenecks where you have a lot of people desperate to move to Egypt. Many people travel all the way into Ethiopia, then cross by road to Sudan, hoping to go by bus by road to Egypt. The same way people move all the way to Niger, trying to cross the Sahara to get into Libya in order to find their way to Europe, either through Algeria, Morocco, or across Libya to Lampedusa and all that. So these Egypt and Libya and Sudan, they have syndicates that are involved in this illegal harvesting of organs. Indeed, I think EU in 2018 estimated that illegal harvesting of organs in Europe was about 50 billion euros then per year. The operations involve kidnapping and murder to obtain organs, primarily targeting immigrants from East Africa like Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. The trafficked organs are then distributed to various countries, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the USA, and parts of Europe. Global trafficking networks span across many nations, engaging in illegal organ removal, transportation, and sale on the black market. Local trafficking rings also operate in specific African regions, consisting of individuals with knowledge of local population and potential victims. Like I said, in Nigeria usually is so-called native doctors or herbalists or juju priests that indulge in this. People think that they go to them to make money, but we have never found anybody pounding human heart and using it to make money. So there is more to it than just medical or herbal purposes. But they are usually the agents that people use because people normally go to them with problems, asking for need, and then from there they lure them in and they harvest their organs. Next, please. Next slide, Neymar. Okay. So this just a kind of see how convoluted this whole thing has become. You have the drivers, you have the actors. The demand is there. Demand and the supply are the key drivers. The demand for organs is growing every time, and there's a long list everywhere in Europe, America, even Africa, everywhere for people waiting for different types of organs. And the supply is usually not as fast. And so that creates a room for traffickers to now begin to harvest. In fact, even in Nigeria, even this something as simple as blood donation, there's a syndicate making some people donate blood all the time for money and all that. So people always, criminals will always exploit where there are gaps. And that's what is happening with regard to issue of illegal organ harvesting, organ removal. And the problem is that there is no strong international consensus to fight this and to identify this problem and to deal with it. So each country is just doing the little it can. And most countries actually are in denial because there is no legislation or no regulation about it. Next slide, please. So some recommendations: strengthen legislation and law enforcement efforts. This is very important. If there is no law, there is no crime. In most countries, there is no specific crime legislation against this crime. Nigeria has mentioned it in the Trafficking Act, also in the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, but it needs to now be scaled into a specific legislation because it covers a whole gamut of things, including medical science, including public health, and so on and so forth. So it needs to be really, really attended to. Enhancing regional and international cooperation. This has become a global problem, and it is very important that countries come together. Let's have international conventions. Let's have treaties. Let us have the UN looking into it. Let's have the AU. Let's have the EU talk about it and begin to really concisely define what this problem is, and let's agree on how to go about it. Of course, there has to be continuous public awareness campaigns and education, like what Africa is doing. Civil society can do this very well, and also public agencies that are charged with the same responsibility. Now, of course, support for victims, identification, rehabilitation, and protection. This is very difficult because victims are difficult to come by. Either they are dead or they don't even know that the organs have been harvested. Some people, yes, they give their organs willingly, thinking that there's no harm. But what they are giving in return is so little, and there's no medical support to enable them to actually heal properly and to cope without the organ that has been harvested. Last slide. In conclusion, organ harvesting is an insidious and pervasive crime that is clandestine in nature and preys on poverty, ignorance, and desperation of many vulnerable people. In Nigeria, there are legislations in place to criminalize the trade and punish offenders, but enforcement remains a considerable challenge due to corruption, inadequate resources, and a lack of public awareness. There's an urgent need for in-depth research and investigation to understand and document the extent and context of organ harvesting in Nigeria and West Africa. Before I retired, this was something I really wanted to do, but I didn't get enough support to be able to work with law enforcement with the research side and investigation for us to really go underground and see what is going on. It is very important. It is very needful for us to begin to understand the extent of this problem. ECOWAS should initiate a sub-regional coordination of member states to more effectively legislate against and enforce laws against organ harvesting, especially along the coasts of the Atlantic Ocean. Civil society must prevail on Nigerian police to investigate cases of ritual murder to determine what the harvested organs are used for and who procures them. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Godwin. This is an extremely enlightening presentation, somehow very distressing, actually, because of some of the issues you covered. You talked about how cases of organ harvesting in Nigeria are usually conflicted with ritualistic killings. So it then gives the leeway for the police and law enforcement not to really act to address it. You also talked about the dichotomy of the poor, desperate people being targeted by, organ harvesters, if I can use that term. But one of the things that you talked about that I feel is really difficult to deal with, and I know it's not just in Nigeria, it happens in many other countries, is the role that medical establishments play in the harvesting of organs, egg cells, tissues of patients, and that corruption and weak enforcement of the law means that these practices are not actually even being addressed at all. So you recommended the strengthening of law enforcement and enhancing global cooperation to address this problem. Thank you so much for your contribution. We really appreciate that. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Iain Ross, who is an officer at the London Metropolitan Police Modern Slavery and Child Exploitation Team. His unit investigated the first known case of organ trafficking in the UK, and he has worked in a number of different roles during his police service, including investigations, response policing, and international policing. Iain, if you're there, you have the floor for the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the previous speaker. I really got a lot from that. It was absolutely fascinating. First off, is my audio okay? Can you hear me all right, everyone?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'll put my PowerPoint on in a moment. Obviously, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot to cover here. I'm going to talk about the case itself, which was investigated by my unit, which is the Modern Slavery and Child Exploitation Unit in the Metropolitan Police.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Iain. Very, very enlightening and illuminating your presentation on the Ekwemadu case. And I mean, for those of us on the outside, all we know is what we read in the media, but it was important that you actually alluded to the potential for financial exploitation as well. So we're not just looking at organ trafficking, we're also looking at financial exploitation of the young man.
It's huge. It's a huge area. It all interlinks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Really pleased that you were able to join us, Iain. Thank you. So I just really want to introduce Dr. Sean Columb to explore the issue of organ trafficking between North Africa and Europe. Dr. Sean, so I'm Nigerian, so we always say Dr. Sean, Dr. somebody. So pardon me, Sean. Dr. Sean is a senior lecturer in law at the School of Law and Social Justice, University of Liverpool. His research interests include human trafficking, extralegal migration, and transnational crime. Sean's current research examines how organ trade fits into the anti-trafficking framework, is linked to organized crime and the wider political economy. He has published numerous articles on this topic in peer-leading journals, including the British Journal of Criminology and Law and Society Review. Sean, you have the floor for the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just thinking I sent you a long bio. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen here. 1 second. Let me start the slideshow. Okay, so I've been researching the organ trade for over a decade now. And one of the most important things for me to do, so I've got a legal background, but I was seeing all these laws being introduced, but without any direct engagement with people actually involved in the organ trade. So for me, from the very beginning, it was important to try and get a sense of what was taking place. How was the trade being organized? How did organ markets emerge to begin with? And why were certain people being compelled to sell their kidneys? Or what was making them vulnerable to trafficking in some instances? So for me, it was really important to try and talk to people who had sold or arranged for the sale of kidneys, but also to talk to medical professionals as well who were involved. So unlike other different types of crimes, with organ trafficking, this can't take place without the involvement of medical professionals, either the indirect or direct involvement. So for me, it was really important to try and do some field work. And most of my field work over the last 10 years has been focused on North Africa, Egypt in particular, but also Sudan more recently. So I was in Sudan in March, following up on some of the research that I'd done over the last 7 years in Egypt and Libya as well. So I think the law has been covered. So the last two presentations were excellent, very informative. I think we've talked enough about the legal framework, but I want to give you a little bit more context based on some of the interviews that I've done over the last few years. So I'm going to start with, I think I've spoken to maybe from 2014 up into 2023, this year, I must have spoken to maybe 70 people that have been involved in different aspects of organ trading. The majority of people that I spoke to had sold a kidney or were compelled to sell a kidney for different reasons. And these were people that were exploited, but not everybody that I spoke to was recognized as a victim, which was problematic, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So I think I want to talk to you about someone I met in 2018 and have stayed in contact with since. And I think his story is important because it talks about some of the reasons why migrants in particular are being targeted for their organs. And it also shows the overlap and intersection with different types of illicit networks like people smuggling. So Dawit, he's from Eritrea, and he was conscripted into national service when he was 13 years of age. And he was in Sawa detention center. And he told me that he told me it was basically a prison. He'd been there for months on end. He said he was being brainwashed. He didn't want to be a soldier. This isn't what he wanted to do with his life. His family saved up everything that they had to help him escape. So they paid a smuggler to help him escape from Sawa, military detention center. And he passed through a mountain pass in Sebderat and into Kassala in Sudan. And he didn't want to go to the refugee camp in Kassala. So there's a refugee camp called Shagarab, but he told me the conditions there were horrible, that everyone there was sick and dying, and that there was no support, no services whatsoever. So he wanted to bypass that as much as possible. He didn't want to register for asylum in Sudan. He wanted to go to either Libya or to Egypt and possibly find his way to Europe if there was an option for him. But at this stage, he got to Kassala. He reached out to another smuggler who took him to Khartoum. And in Khartoum, he was working for a number of months, close to a year, working at a car wash. He wasn't receiving a lot of money and he was struggling. And he spoke to people who had gone to Egypt. He spoke to people who had gone to Libya. And he felt like he had a better opportunity if he took this chance. But he was also aware of the risks involved. So many of the people that he had spoken to had gone to Libya, they had been detained, or they had attempted to cross and were pushed back, were placed in detention centers, were exposed to all kinds of abuse. So he knew there was a lot of risks in going to Libya, but he also knew there was possibly a better chance that if he went to Libya, he could get a crossing into Lampedusa or into Sicily and eventually Italy. But eventually he decided that the best route for him was to go through to Egypt. So here's a map that gives an idea of the different routes available. This is in 2018. Things have changed now with the war in Sudan. So a lot of people are going directly from Ethiopia into South Sudan and then into Uganda and then trying to find different routes. I think one thing that you see in common over the last few years, where there's conflict, where there's poverty, you'll see organized crime emerge and develop and take a stronghold. So Dawit, he he was in Kinsala for a number of months. He reached out to another smuggler who was recommended to him by friends who had gone onwards to Egypt beforehand. And this smuggler told him, look, you don't have to pay for the price beforehand. I know you don't have enough money, but come to Egypt. You can work for a while and then we can see what happens afterwards. So Dawood went to Cairo, and he trusted this particular smuggler, and he set him up a work in a factory producing steel. And the work was completely unregulated. He told me that he was exposed to chemicals. There was no safety gear. He was working crazy hours, 12 hours a day, for little to no money. And all of the time, the smuggler was asking him for his money. He wanted more money. So they had agreed on a price before he went to Cairo, and then that price had increased once he had arrived there. So I think the agreement was that he would pay $200 or $300, and then that was increased to over $1,000. And then he was actually asked for more money because the smuggler who brought him to Cairo told him that he also wanted money for his brokerage services for helping him find Organ. So when Dawood was working at this industrial complex, working in a steel factory, he hated it, and he was really upset. He was staying in a hotel at the time in Cairo, downtown Cairo, and someone approached him and told him that they had a solution. They told him that if he sold his kidney, he could use this money to travel to the North Egyptian coast into Alexandria or Damietta. He could attempt to make a crossing there, or he could cross over to Benghazi, where there were more options and more smuggling services available. He was also told that if he could generate around 10,000 to 20,000, if he paid more for the smuggling services, that he would get a better service. So he was told that basically, if you could pay over $10,000, you would be guaranteed a reliable trip across the Mediterranean. So as opposed to going from Benghazi, where maybe he would pay 5,000 and go across, or attempt to cross the Mediterranean on a rubber dinghy, he could go across on a fishing vessel that was more reliable and there was less people on board. So he thought this was the best option, and he didn't want to register for asylum in Egypt because he had spoken to so many people who were completely disillusioned with the UNHCR refugee system. So different people that he spoke to told him, look, this is an absolute dead end. If you register with the UN, you're not going to get any support. Your passport will be taken. He didn't have one anyway, and you're never going to move. Your mobility will be completely locked in, and you have no chance of finding good work or supporting your family. And that was weighing on Dawood all the time. So one of the reasons he came to Egypt, and one of the reasons he wanted to move on to Europe or a third country, was to help his family. So his family had saved everything they had to get him out of Sawa so that he could go onwards, find better job opportunities and help them, essentially. And this was always on his mind. And this was the major reason he considered selling his kidney. So he was approached by this man. He didn't really want to do it, but he told me, look, I trusted the broker. He was Eritrean as well. And he introduced me to someone else who sold a kidney. He looked okay. I thought this might work. And the way that he convinced me, I was told from the broker that if I sell a kidney, I'm going to save someone's life. And in the process, I can help myself and my family. So this sounded like a good situation. So Dawood did his research online. He looked at what was involved in transplantation and thought, okay, maybe this is worth the risk. And this is probably better than going to Libya, where the chances are I will be detained. I'll be asked to call my family and they'll have to send me money that I can't have. And he had spoken to other people who were in a similar situation. And I've spoken to several people who've gone through Libya. They've been detained or they've been pushed back when they've tried to cross the Mediterranean. And then they were asked to pay for their release. This is in official and unofficial detention centers. So like the first speaker mentioned, many of the detention centers are being managed by militias in Libya. And people who can't afford to pay for their release, they're forced to work or they're exploited in other ways. Other people that I spoke to who were in Libya were told that if they sold a kidney, they could raise the necessary money. And from what I know, the kidneys weren't being removed in Libya, but they were being transferred to Egypt and accompanied by associates, and then the money was being taken once the surgery was actually completed. So what I could see over the last few years, in particular from 2020 to 2023, is that the organ trade has become an extreme form of debt management for people who have no access to legal routes, to claim asylum or to claim refugee status. And for many of the people that were living in Egypt, they felt like refugee status didn't have any real meaning anymore. They were required to register the refugee status every 6 months. And if they didn't, they lost that status. and they didn't really feel that it had any added value. In fact, they felt that if they were registered as refugees, that every movement was being monitored, and that that was cutting off any possible chances of them leaving again. And a lot of people that I spoke to also told me that despite the fact that they should have qualified for resettlement, so one woman that I spoke to was trafficked when she arrived in Egypt and her kidneys were taken by force. She was told that if she didn't donate a kidney, that the group involved would forcibly take her kidney or a kidney from one of her children. This was reported to the UNHCR, and she was supposed to be resettled, but for many years that didn't take place. I've been involved in that case for maybe 5 or 6 years, and only now has she been resettled. She's actually been resettled in the UK. But there was a lot of claims at the time, and I don't want to say too much about this, but there was a lot of claims that people were paying to get priority treatment in terms of resettlement. And if you couldn't make that payment, you weren't going to get resettled anytime soon. I've also heard claims of UNHCR corruption in Sudan and also in other countries, obviously including Libya as well. So back to Dawood's story, he agreed to sell his kidney for $6,000, and he thought this might be the best way to support himself and to support his family. And he felt completely cut off from any other type of opportunity to help himself. So Dawood was brought to an apartment just before the surgery took place. And part of the reason for that was that the group involved wanted to just make sure that he didn't change his mind. So he wasn't physically coerced into doing this. He was promised $6,000. And during this period of time, he was brought to a number of different tissue typing labs for blood tests and for urine samples to make sure that he was compatible with somebody else, with a recipient who was traveling from overseas for transplant tourism. The other reason that this happened, and I know this from talking to a number of different brokers over the years, is that what the brokers do sometimes is that they take their clients and they call the people that they work with victims, essentially, clients. They bring them to different tissue typing labs so that they can negotiate a higher price with the lab. So the organ trade is much more common than people realize it is. There's a dependency on the legal supply in many countries. And what was happening in Egypt, at least, is that some of these labs who were attached or had connections to hospitals, they were working with a number of different brokers, and the brokers were recruiting people for paid donation. And the brokers then were going to different labs and trying to get a better price for their services. So the brokers were being paid directly from the transplant labs, who were then working with different hospitals that actually were involved in the performance of the transplant surgery. So Dawood, he was actually brought to a clinic outside of Cairo, and he believes it was close to Alexandria because he remembers seeing the coast. And there was no, before the surgery took place, nobody told him about the surgery. Nobody told him what to prepare for. There was no aftercare. I think after a day, he was discharged and brought to another apartment to convalesce. And you can see here that the surgery, it wasn't done very well. The incision is large, so it was done very quickly. It was rushed, and there wasn't any real care taken. He was brought to an apartment directly afterwards, and he was brought here to convalesce. But the other reason he was brought here, and I know this again from talking to several people who have sold kidneys as well as brokers, they didn't want him basically to attract any unwanted attention. So after the surgery, there could be some complications. Maybe there was some blood from his wound. They didn't want him walking around and attracting attention that might lead to a potential investigation or put pressure on the police to actually investigate this. So he stayed in an apartment to convalesce for about a month to 2 months. And during that time, he was asking for his money. He was like, where's my money? And the broker, he gave him, I think it was $2,000 in advance, and told him that he would pay the rest once he had convalesced. And during this time, he was introduced to a colleague of the broker who said that he was a smuggler, and one of the best smugglers in North Africa, and that he promised to work with Dawood and to bring him across the central Mediterranean route, so across the Mediterranean Sea once he had recovered. But in order to do that, he needed a down payment. So he said he made an agreement that he would be paid the additional money that Dawood was owed. And Dawood agreed to this. And then once he agreed, he noticed that the two people that were involved, so the broker and the smuggler who had been visiting him on a regular basis, checking in on him to see if he was okay, they just stopped visiting. He had their phone number, but they weren't answering. So I'm just going to read out a quote because I think it's better that you understand this from Dawood's side of things. Once he convalesced, once he got better, once he recovered, he called the broker. Let's call the broker Ali. So all of these names are pseudonyms, by the way. He called him multiple times. And eventually he tracked him down and he was told that they were going to sort out this. They were going to honor the arrangement. So I waited for hours and I called him many times. He told me that they were on the way. Every time I called, he told me that they were coming, but they never arrived. So he was waiting for them in Tahrir Square, actually. So Ali, the broker's mobile was turned off. I took my phone and I smashed it against the ground. I remember watching it break into small pieces, and then I could feel it, the regret hitting me. I sat down crying, thinking about how I have sacrificed everything since leaving my family, and I have nothing to show for it. They've gone away with my money and they've taken my kidney. So this story, unfortunately, is common. So over the last 10 years, like I've said, I've spoken to a lot of people who have agreed to sell their kidneys because of their current circumstances. So there was an economic of last resort for the majority of people that I spoke to. Some people were physically coerced, others because of their situation, they were taken advantage of. They were exploited. So Dawood, after this happened, he went to the police and he reported what happened. He was told two things. First of all, he was asked for his refugee papers. He was asked for his documentation to prove that he was in the country legally. He didn't have that. And then he explained that he was a refugee, and he was told to go to the UNHCR because he wasn't the responsibility of the Egyptian state. The second thing he was asked was if he stole his kidney. And he tried to explain that, yes, he agreed to sell it, but he was compelled to do this because of his circumstances. And in any case, he was deceived into selling his kidney. He was told that he could be arrested because it was a legal offense to sell a kidney. So the last two speakers mentioned this as well. Why are there so few prosecutions? I think from what I can see with my research, one of the reasons why is that people are afraid to come forward unless they can prove that they've been trafficked. But that's a very difficult thing to do. So a lot of people that I've spoken to, they're sold a kidney because of their circumstances, whether they were asylum seekers, refugees, or if they were deceived into selling a kidney. But even if they were trafficked and physically coerced, that can be difficult to prove. So because it was illegal to sell their kidney, the brokers actually used the threat of criminal sanction to silence their victims. So many people that I was spoken to, they were told, okay, if you go to the authorities and report us, you're going to be arrested. So to give another example, one woman that I spoke to about 2 years ago, and this was in Cairo, she went back to the hospital where her kidney was removed, and she asked to speak to the doctor. She wasn't happy. She didn't get paid what she was promised. And instead, she waited for maybe 2 or 3 hours at a particular hospital. I'm not going to name the hospital. The doctor never appeared, but a lawyer appeared. And he brought to her a consent form. And he said, look, you've signed this consent form. This consent form proves that you voluntarily donated your kidney. This was altruistic. Now, if you want to say it wasn't voluntary, you're going to be liable for a criminal sanction. It's illegal to sell a kidney. So I think that might explain why there's so few prosecutions. People are afraid to come forward to report what's happening. And I think there are issues in identifying victims, not just with the organ trade, but with different forms of exploitation and different forms of trafficking. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but this is taken from a panorama documentary I did a few years ago. And this is from an interview with a broker. So many of the brokers that I actually spoke to, and there's different levels of brokerage involved. Some of the brokers that I spoke to had sold their kidneys, and they were essentially being controlled by shame and told that, look, if you don't work with us, or if you don't help us recruit somebody else, we're going to tell everyone that you know that you sold your kidney. And people were ashamed to talk about this. So one of the reasons I think people wanted to talk to me is that they wanted to get it off their chest. So I think that's an issue that needs to be much more awareness of what's involved, and the stigma around selling a kidney needs to be looked into as well and discussed in more detail. So like I said, a lot of people that I spoke to sold the kidney, but they felt like they had no choice. They were still being taken advantage of. They were still being exploited, but that level of exploitation isn't recognized in the law, which I think is a problem. So this particular broker, he told me that he was seeing between 20 and 30 people a week. So that means he was recruiting over 20 or 30 people a week. And other brokers told me that they were talking about similar numbers and that the organ trade was very much an active business. And with COVID, I think those numbers have only increased. Actually, I know those numbers have only increased. I still have contact with many people in Egypt. The current war in Sudan has made things worse. I know that a lot of people are in a very desperate situation. They can't find any way to raise money. And the organ trade, like I said, is an economic option of last resort for a number of people. It's the only way that they can think of to find or to produce an income. And brokers and the groups that they're working with are taking advantage of this. So one of the reasons that the organ trade or illicit organ removal overlaps with people smuggling is that over the last few years, smuggling services have increased because there's been more border controls, there's more militarized policing, it's more difficult to cross, maybe there's more risks involved. And basically what's happening is the groups it's not just one big group, these are separate groups. So some of them are bigger groups, some smaller groups, but some of the groups involved in smuggling, for example, they're referring people to brokers in Cairo to sell their kidneys to raise the necessary money to pay for their services. And then even if you pay maybe 8,000, you're not guaranteed successful crossing. You end up getting pushed back, you end up getting detained, you get into more debt. And this is increasing, it's helping brokers actually recruit people.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm out of time.
Is that your last? Yeah, is that your last slide?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about there is a lot of corruption involved here as well. So the brokers, to get the paperwork done, a lot of the surgeries are actually taking place in legitimate hospitals. And a lot of the doctors that I spoke to, they told me that they weren't detectives, that it's just their job to perform the surgery, and assuming that the paperwork is completed, everything's in order. So I asked the broker about the paperwork, and he told me that he accompanied people to get their papers stamped and approved. And he told me that he made discretionary payments to specific members of staff in embassies, but also in medical ministries to approve the paperwork without any questions asked. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. This is extremely educative, and for those who work in the trafficking sector. So sometimes we see people at this end of it, but we don't actually realize the journey that they've gone through and all the things that they had to endure, including, the possibility of organ harvesting, organ trafficking, the role of brokers. You talked a lot about the role of brokers. You talked a lot about the role of transplant and labs. So you talked about the threats of sanctions to compel people to donate their organs. You talked about the shame involved for many of these people, which is one of the reasons why they're not actually coming forward, to report. Not only that, the fear of repercussions, the fear of retributions from brokers, and so on. And I mean, it's a very, very rich, very educative session. Thank you very much. So we do have 2 more speakers. And I really want us to have an engaging session as well. And I don't want to deprive any speaker of their time. So if you all agree, can we have an extra 10 minutes? So we're finishing around 10 past 1 or 1:15 even, please. Right. So for that, based on that, I'm going to call on Eleanor. If you can prepare your presentation whilst I introduce you, Eleanor. Eleanor is the... Eleanor Stephenson is a barrister, and she's going to talk about forced organ harvesting and unethical organ transplantation in China. Eleanor is a UK qualified barrister and practices in international and domestic crime. She has recently been instructed at the Kosovo Tribunal in The Hague, and before that on the prosecution team at the International Criminal Court on the Darfur case. She is also the legal and communications manager at the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. You have the floor for the next 20 minutes, Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. So as you heard, I'm Eleanor Stephenson, and I'm an international criminal lawyer. Today, I'm going to speak to you on organ trafficking, in particular forced organ harvesting in China and unethical organ transplantation. So as many people have mentioned today, organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting, it's very much an unseen form of human trafficking and a much lesser discussed form of human trafficking. there is a great need to raise more awareness on the issue. So I've been working on this since 2019, when I first attended the China tribunal hearings that were taking place in central London. So over the course of 2 weekends, I listened to harrowing testimonies from brave survivors of the Chinese detention camps, through which forced organ harvesting was and continues to be conducted on a very large scale. I also learned there that it was a state-sanctioned regime and it had been going on for 20 years. So that led me to start campaigning on behalf of the victims and survivors. And I do this through an organization called the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. And that organization, they're behind many of the major developments in tackling this major abuse. I'd also like to thank Afruka and Debbie for inviting me to speak. I feel very honored to say a few words today. Now, organ trafficking, forced organ harvesting, and unethical transplantation, it's a global issue. Organ transplantation, it's often heralded as a medical marvel. It provides a critical lifeline to those that face end-stage organ failure. And to me, it always seemed like the epitome of human generosity. You have one consenting to the donation of their organs to save the life of someone unknown to them or their family. However, there is an extreme global shortage of organs, and the demand far outstrips the supply that's available through national transplantation programs. So as we know, there are waiting times of months or years, or people don't get one at all. Inevitably, there's now a large black market for organs. And the instances of transplant tourism, which is where people pay to travel to go to other countries to undergo surgery, often in very short timeframes, and often without there being any proper consent from the donor, that's increased twofold in the last 20 years. And now that accounts for over 10% of the world's transplants. So that is a very large amount of unethical conduct. So the black market for organs, it's extremely lucrative. The revenue ranges between $840 million US to $1.7 billion US. To give you an idea of costs of organs, the retail price for a kidney can range from $50,000 to $100,000 US, and for a pancreas between $110,000 and $140,000 US. Now, of course, due to that lucrative nature, there's now a consistent demand for organs in many areas of the world, and we see these transplant tourism routes established in that they're particularly rampant in India, Pakistan, Egypt, and Lebanon. Now, the World Health Organization, it urges the prohibition of the commercialization of organs, and it says that donors should act willingly and free of any undue influence or coercion. And it does not consider that a person can be willing if that person is selling their organs or receiving other benefits. And the reasons for that are perhaps obvious, but often ignored. So there's a huge disparity between the average donor and recipient. The average donor is 29 years old and earning an income of $480 US per year, in contrast to a typical male recipient being 48 years old and earning around $53,000 per year. So the circumstances in which that donation takes place, and we're talking about the financial vulnerability of that donor here, that raises serious issues as to voluntary consent. And the principle of voluntary consent is, of course, central to ethical organ transplantation. And it's not just okay that the donor says yes, circumstances have to be looked at. And we've talked about the Nigerian trafficking case, but just to mention that there's now, we're beginning to see a shift in attitude towards organ trafficking since that case, and it's a huge leap forward in our campaign work. So in many parts of the world, you have extremely poor people being forced into selling an organ because of economic circumstances. So in effect, they're being exploited by the unethical or the desperate. So whether donors are alive or they've died, they have to provide consent. But despite that, we're still seeing a wide-scale sale of organs in exchange for monetary value. And as other speakers have talked about, you have brokering agents who are working on behalf of individual doctors and hospitals, and it's known that doctors and hospitals are offering entire service packages that cover all associated costs. So you can consider the practice of unethical organ transplantation on a sliding scale with various degrees of severity. So you have isolated violations of the principle of consent after death, to the widespread voluntary sale of organs coerced under economic duress, to systematic criminal activity of organ trafficking or trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, to a state-sanctioned regime in the People's Republic of China of organs forcibly removed from prisoners, otherwise known as forced organ harvesting, each of them serious. So now I'm going to tell you a bit more about forced organ harvesting in China. Since the early 2000s, there have been concerns about systematic perpetration of forced organ harvesting. In the early 2000s, you had the PRC leaping from a follower to a leader in organ transplantation technology. And despite there being no voluntary donation system, within 4 years, China made impressive developments in the field of organ transplantation. Hospital numbers tripled and surgery expanded from solely kidneys to hearts, lungs, and livers. And then you had simultaneously transplant tourists were reported to have access to matched organs within a few weeks or months. The transplant operations were planned, recipients were given exact dates when the operation would take place. So you have to ask yourself, how was it that hospitals were able to do this? So that question and a simultaneous rapid expansion of the infrastructure, that raised grave concerns about how organs were being obtained. And allegations of a state-sanctioned regime of forced organ harvesting, including from non-death row prisoners, they soon followed. In 2009, the PRC officially confirmed that 2/3 of organs supplied for organ transplants were from death row prisoners. And the PRC asserted rather unconvincingly that they had consented. Investigations showed, however, that supply had to be coming from non-death row prisoners, and that was on the basis that the execution of death penalty prisoners declined since 2000, but the number of organ that continued to increase. Investigations also showed it was coming from another source, and that source was the Falun Gong practitioners in China. Falun Gong, it's a Buddhist Qigong, a meditation practice, and their organs are considered the best because of the healthy lifestyle that they lead. They don't smoke and they don't drink alcohol. Falun Gong, it's got 3 core principles, and those are truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. And as you may appreciate, this ideology, it's completely at odds with the ideology of the CCP, and was consequently perceived as a threat to their rule. In 1999, you had 70 million people practicing Falun Gong in China nationwide, and that was larger than the registered membership of the CCP. Now, the growing of the organ transplant infrastructure, that coincided with a brutal campaign initiated against the Falun Gong in 1999. So you had a senior member of the Chinese Communist Party called Jiang Zemin. He started a crackdown and publicly stated that he was going to defame their reputations, destroy their bodies, and bankrupt them financially. And what ensued were extrajudicial killings and disappearances on a large scale. In 2010, the PRC publicly announced that by 2015, organ procurement from executed prisoners would end, and that voluntary organ donation and a voluntary organ donation system would be set up. But that is not to have been genuine, because investigations show that the number of organ transplants still far exceeds the number of registered donors on the voluntary organ donation system. So in 2019, an independent people's tribunal was set up in the UK, and it was chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice KC, and he was the lawyer that led the Slobodan Milosevic trial in The Hague. There was a panel that consisted of 7 other experts, including leading surgeons, and together they carried out the first extensive independent review of all available evidence on forced organ harvesting. They heard from over 70 witnesses. They reviewed documentary evidence, and they listened to staged telephone calls to hospitals in China where callers asked for transplants at short notice. Now, as I said, it was absolutely shocking to hear the evidence through oral testimonies and in person from these brave victims. And these victims had endured arbitrary detention, often for many years, and torture of the gravest kind. And by the way, all the evidence is available to you. You can hear all the testimony, see all the testimonies, read the judgment at chinatribunal.com. So the PRC, they didn't engage in the hearings despite being invited on numerous occasions. It's also worthy of note that nor would the UK government. They were and continue to be uncooperative on the issue. And we know that the BBC was due to broadcast the findings of the tribunal at 10 p.m. on Newsnight, the day of the pronouncement of the judgment. We know that they got a call, we think, from the Foreign Office, telling them not to air the programme, so they didn't. So the panel found that the evidence was overwhelming, and they unanimously concluded beyond reasonable doubt that there was a state-sanctioned regime of forced organ harvesting in China, and innocent Falun Gong practitioners were the main source of organ supply. So therefore, the only answer to that question, therefore, how is it that operations are planned in advance and that people can receive an organ at extremely short notice, is that there's a large number of readily available donors, and that live donors in China, their tissue typing is already logged on a system, and when a request comes in from a transplant tourist, those individuals who are a match are taken and killed. So they are killed to order, and it's nothing less than that. Now, as you can imagine, there are very few Chinese surgeons that have spoken about this. However, there is one surgeon called Enver Tohti who has confessed to have carried out these operations. He's now fled China, and he's a whistleblower engaged in campaign work. So here he is speaking about an operation he carried out.
During my time in our outpatient department, that I have seen at least 3 children had a scar on their body, indicates the organ had been stolen. And in 1995, it comes to my turn to do it. It was a Wednesday. My 2 chief surgeons called me into the office and told me to assemble a team with capability of largest possible surgery and report to them next day morning. 9:30 next day, we met at the hospital gate and headed towards the Western Mountain execution ground, where I was told to wait for them until hearing the gunshots. After gunshots were heard, we rushed in. An armed officer directed us to the far right corner, where I can see a civilian-clothed man lying on the ground with a single bullet wound to his right chest. My chief surgeons then ordered and guided me, extracted the liver and 2 kidneys. The man was alive. He tried to resist my scalpel cut, but too weak to avoid my action. There was bleeding. He was still alive, but I didn't feel guilty. In fact, I didn't feel anything but like a full programmed robot doing its task. I thought I was carrying my duty to eliminate the enemy of the state. After operation, those chief surgeons took this organs with two strange-looking boxes, and they told me to take my team back to the hospital and remember there was nothing happened, and I followed order. We never talked about it. It is not acceptable that a normal buy one get one free shopping pattern can be seen in organ transplantation. Pre-date for your heart transplantation means that they make someone dead for you. Giving away organs to promote business means they have organ of plenty. Unlimited supply of organs only can be achieved if those organs are carried in the living body waiting to be taken on demand. A news broke out last June that CCP is giving Uyghur people in Xinjiang free national health checkup with no explanation why. So we suspect that the CCP is building the national database for organ trade. It is also widely reported that CCP is carrying out DNA tests in the region under the glorified of improving the quality of the life of Uyghurs. And that is, I believe, it's a lie. Thank you.
So that's Enver Tohti. It's extremely risky what he's doing, but his contribution is invaluable, as you can imagine. So what's being done about this? That there have been numerous calls to action from the international community. Jeffrey Nice, KC, at the end of the China Tribunal, said any person or organisation that interacts in any substantial way with the PRC should recognise that they're interacting with a criminal state. There have been calls from the European Parliament. On the 10th of March 2023 in the US, there's a new bill going through. It passed a significant stage in Congress in March, and Representative Chris Smith, his final comments were, people are finally waking up to the brutality of the CCP. We in the United States, in the medical field in particular, must examine our moral complicity in this most heinous of crimes. You've got laws that are being developed to deal with the issue. So you have the Stop Bill in the US, and it is very likely to pass. It will impose harsher penalties for purchasing organs, prohibit export of organ transplant surgery devices to entities responsible for human organ trafficking. It will impose sanctions on individuals and government officials in countries who support human organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting. And it's also going to introduce mandatory reporting on human organ trafficking in foreign countries, and also on US institutions which train organ transplant surgeons. Because what you have is Western institutions training Chinese surgeons who go back and then perform these operations in China with their newly acquired knowledge. You've got many countries such as Belgium, France, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They have tabled similar domestic and regional legislation. You also have the Global Rights Compliance Legal Advisory, which you can see on the screen here. It's a groundbreaking advisory published in 2022, and it explores how medical organisations, including the individuals that work in them, such as surgeons, or board members of pharmaceutical companies, it explores how they can be prosecuted for complicity in forced organ harvesting, and how they might get caught up through things like a UK transplant surgeon providing training to a Chinese surgeon who is known to go back and work in a state-run hospital where forced organ harvesting is occurring. Or you might get companies like Pfizer and Roche who are supplying immunosuppressant drugs for operations in China.
I just want to say, Ellie, that you've overrun your time. So if you can please round up.
Okay, sure. Okay. So I just wanted to make two main points. Perhaps my first one was that the legislation at the moment, as everybody has said, it's insufficient. So what we really need to do is introduce a regulation that has universal consensus. There's the Convention on Trafficking in Europe, but there's only been 13 ratifications of that. But that's a good instrument, a good example, which people should, countries need to sign up to. And the other thing that really would make a difference if we can get governments to stand up to China. So the objections that we see and MPs who campaign on the issue that don't get China angry is because we need them to reach net zero, and also we need them for business interests. Firstly, China has no intention of keeping to its word. They don't care about net zero. They won't do anything they say. They've shown that they don't keep to their word. What they will do is anything to become the most powerful state in the world, and they won't stop until they get that. We might need them for business interests, but they're a major security threat, an industrial threat. And this is the next human rights crisis in China after the Uyghurs, and we have to say so. And if it was any other government, they would have been ostracized by now, but because it's China, people are afraid. So really, we need political will, and it isn't there yet. I worked on law reform recently on the procurement bill, trying to get an amendment into the procurement bill. And ultimately, the government rejected our amendment because they said it was too onerous on businesses, and it would have stopped taxpayers' money going into anything relating to forced organ harvesting in China. But essentially,
sorry, Nelly, I have to stop you there.
That's
I'm really
okay.
sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you. We're really short of time now, and I have to give Joe 20 minutes before we take questions. So thank you very much for that,
Okay.
Ellie. And I'm going to call on Joe now. Joe, last but not the least speaker, definitely not in any way or form, Joe. It's nice to see you again. Joe, is currently doing a PhD at University of West London, and her study is focused on insecure bodies, a critical review of the United Kingdom's role and responsibilities within the global organ market. So I'm going to hand over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I assumed that my slides were going to be uploaded.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nema, you have a slide?
Yes, I do. 1 second.
Thank you.
I'll do that for you. I'll still make you co-host anyways, just in case. Please bear with me. I've got this here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the previous speakers. Some of this is a little bit of a repeat, so I will skirt over the bits that are repeated. But my intention with this study was to really look at human organ trafficking from the UK's perspective, because it is a silent narrative, and my interest in this subject started whilst debating with a bunch of colleagues whilst we were studying modern slavery, organised crime and migration, and there was quite a broad spectrum of people in the room, and the consensus was that human organ trafficking was not a problem for the UK, and that included people from Facebook, from Interpol, a very wide spectrum. They all had the same view that whilst it was a problem for America and other westernized countries buying organs from poorer countries, that the UK really didn't have that relationship. And I disagreed. And I disagreed on what seemed maybe at the time just intuition. One, I disagreed because when I was a student nurse wanting to earn extra money, I worked agency in central London at places like the Cromwell and the Wellington and the other big private hospitals. And it was routinely said, if you wanted to earn extra money, you went and looked after the private transplant patients from Arab nations. And that had stuck with me. The second thing was that I had been a counter-fraud specialist in medical insurance, and I knew of cases like Iain Patterson and other cases that been recently prosecuted in the UK that actually demonstrated that the private medical world in the UK is a very different regulated world from the NHS. So this led me down a rabbit hole of looking at the UK's relationship with human trafficking. And I've looked at this from a criminological and sociological view. So the intention of the study was not to recreate or even challenge the statistical data, but rather to look behind the facts and expand the narrative of what trafficking means in the UK, and looking at all different modes of organ trafficking. And first of all, I looked at the Modern Slavery Act, and I looked at the word supply chain, which underpins a lot of the Modern Slavery Act legislation. And I thought, you know, if we're looking at this from a medical perspective, medicine is quite reductive. So let's look at this in simple terms. When we're looking at organ procurement, we're looking at a supply chain. We're looking from raw materials to fulfill an order of a human body. And that may seem brutal, but from what we've heard previously, that when we strip it down, that is the bare bones. We've always had a relationship between medical innovation and exploitation of the human body. We demonstrate similar patterns of behaviour throughout history. When medicine took off, we wanted to explore the human body. We wanted to learn to operate on it. We robbed graves. When we ran out of graves, we wanted anatomical skeletons for medical schools. We started looking abroad. Our relationship with colonising India led to a prolific trade in skeletons coming from India into the UK. We just use the same traits. We exploit the poor to facilitate medical innovation and further the needs of richer nations. And as we reinvent, we just recreate a new problem. The organ trade has a definitive start point, intrinsically related to medical innovation. Without the development of organ transplant in the 1950s and 60s, it would never have become an issue so big until we actually invented anti-rejection drugs and the ventilator, which then made organ transplant more widely available and a more viable procedure. And so we have a start point at the end of the 1980s where the organ trade actually started. And one of the first researchers, Sherpa Hughes, observed that trading in organs has developed along class, gender and racial lines, with organs flowing from the poor to the rich, from women to men, and from ethnic minorities to white people. And here we are in 2023, and we're in exactly the same position. So if we move on to the next slide. So when I looked at the global market in organs, it's far bigger than maybe the narrative that we held in the UK. And so what I wanted to do was actually break it down. So I broke it down into human organ trafficking, transplant tourism, and commercial organ sales, and forced organ. And I felt those four components actually made up the global organ trade. And they're not mutually exclusive. They overlap with each other. And as we carry on, you'll see maybe the importance of commercialized organ sales as well in pharmaceuticals. It's just not within medical institutions and transplant surgeries, but it's also in pharmaceuticals, in medical research, in things such as the Bodyworks displays, which was in Piccadilly in 2019, and which had a direct relationship with forced organ harvesting from China. So it's a far-reaching and far more insidious than maybe we would be led to believe. Sorry, on to the next slide. The UK's narrative was very much that the acquisitions of organs is primarily seen through a medium of human organ trafficking or plant transplant, all that commercialised market. The traffic of organs is prohibited in the UK, while transplant tourism was not subject to the same level of scrutiny and largely undocumented. That has changed slightly during the course of my study with the amendments to the Human Tissue Act. But how clear that is that we are going to be able to police that and actually how that's going to look in a legislative manner is still largely undocumented. The last real National Crime Agency report that recorded cases of human organ trafficking was in 2018. It cited 6 cases as organ trafficking. Obviously, that changed with the Nigerian case, which we've been discussing this morning. These figures could be construed as the UK has a limited exposure to the organ trade. It's a missing narrative. But historically, and when we think about the organ trade starting in the 1980s and into the 1990s, the UK was one of the first countries with the surgeon, Mr. Michael Berwick, at the Cromwell Hospital, in a case which was called the Turkish peasants case, of actually having one of the first incidences of human organ trafficking, which actually went to court and led to the surgeon being struck off by the GMC eventually. In that time period as well, the UK also was found to have actually some brokers working within central London. So we've always had that relationship. It just mainly was undocumented. So when I was thinking about this, I wanted to look at lived experiences. I wanted to look at the supply chain and what that actually meant in terms of sociology, criminology, and the lived experience of people who one are needing organs, 2 who buy organs, and those who have a foot in both camps, if you like. Our migrant communities in the UK quite often will seek medical care back from in their traditional country, and sometimes mix European medicine with traditional medicine, which is quite an important thing, which we'll cover later. But the emerging themes were there were barriers to organ donation and their relationship to the supply chain management. That there was something that I like to call racial itogenesis, that there was an important part of race and how when we looked at figures of those who were likely to die whilst waiting for an organ in the UK, it came from our Black, African and migrant communities, that 11% of people waiting for organs were in fact from those communities. They waited longer for organs, were more likely to need an organ and less likely to donate, and that fascinated me as a something that underpinned and was cited regularly as one of our problems of organ donation in the UK. It was important to understand the history of the organ trade and our relationship to it, and the fact that we have had some of the first cases, that that we are a country of transit. We have a relationship with colonization, the Commonwealth, that we have that relationship, the Windrush, our relationship with the Empire. So it was really important to actually understand the lived experience of the people that pass through, live and settle in the UK. There were touch points with intersections to the organ trade. And I sort of pulled in routine activity theory. I looked at social harm. I looked at itogenesis as a subject, medically induced harm. And I looked at white collar crime, because we've touched on this organ trafficking can't happen unless a medical facility and doctors are present to be able to perform that. And that sanitizes the crime in some ways, because once the procedure starts, heads towards the medical, it legitimizes the whole process. So on to the next slide. So I started looking at the relationships, and I looked at regulation, which we've talked about. And I looked about our relationship with private healthcare as a counter-fraud specialist in this area. I knew that there was a relationship within our private healthcare sector. That there are 5 private healthcare facilities, all based in London, that provide organ transplant. But the actual facts are that you actually don't need a transplant centre to be actually perform an organ transplant. It can happen in any medical facility that has a good operating theatre. So there is that possibility that it can happen outside transplant centres. Within private healthcare, crimes associated with that are called upcoding or miscoding. Each operation around the world has its own unique identifier. It's very easy to put a slightly different operation in. The relationship that private hospitals have with consultants is very different from the NHS. The NHS owns all the medical notes. In private hospitals, the consultants will take their patients' notes away. I could do a whole presentation on medical fraud. So I knew that space existed. I knew that the NHS had a relationship in the terms that it provides our regulation through NHS Blood and Transport, it provides our transport coordinators, but it's also under stress from the figures that I talked about previously, where there were high rates of organ failure, of renal failure, and diabetes and heart among our Black and Asian communities that actually underpinned our high organ donation rates. And then there is the subject of migration and asylum, and that we are a transitory country, that actually at this moment in time we have a crisis, an asylum and migration crisis with aggressive policies that pushes people away from healthcare. And then there were the unknowns. And this was the interesting part. As I started to share my research, as I started to do focus groups, I was approached by NGOs to share knowledge. It became a two-way process. I learned from them. Stop the Traffic approached me, and I think Sean spoke to them as well, because they had noticed a pattern among young Syrian male refugees fleeing war-torn areas and coming down through Iran and into Greece and Turkey. And they had noticed through the process of using social media and doing surveys with them that there were red flags. I think 120 of them did a survey, and 26 came back saying that they had been offered money to travel to get out of Europe. As just as Sean was saying, you know, that process of being offered a journey into a better place, into Europe, was a conversation that was had. When they expanded on that, we did some work and we looked at the language that could be used in the questions. When they came back the next time, actually, it was discovered that there was quite a prevalent marketplace in testicle removal, and we're still trying to find out what that is based to. But I think it's probably maybe pharmaceutical and medical research. But these were actual live stories coming back with life experience, that they were being offered money for organs or parts of their body in return for funds to travel abroad. A21, another NGO, has undertaken a programme of educating key workers within NHS, police forces, social work departments. There was a lack of knowledge while expressing an evidence of patients displaying signs of organ removal. So once these conversations were started, the doctors, the nurses, the practitioners in whichever field were coming back saying, you know, I might know somebody like that, or so-and-so had a scar that they couldn't explain. And during this process, I started doing interviews, and my first initial 6 interviews really took my breath away, because I questioned myself. Other researchers had questioned me as to be whether I was being fanciful about my subject in the UK. I focused my first set of research on migrant communities. My first subject I spoke to was a Kurdish lady who had been trafficked or smuggled out of Turkey as a 19-year-old pregnant woman as part of a forced marriage. Her narrative around kidney transplant was very much based by what her belief was and what she thought she knew of a organ market existing in Turkey, and that she was a vulnerable person as a Kurdish woman. She said, I can be persecuted twice, once for being Kurdish, once for my religion. And she believed quite fervently that her father had sold her younger brother's kidney at age 14. And whether that was true or not, that belief, she she had that belief. So when we spoke about organ donation in altruistic terms in the UK, her first response was, I wouldn't interact with that because I could have my kidney taken. So we start seeing patterns of the resistance to why people aren't interacting with organ transplant. And when we discussed the new legislation around organ donation, where everybody's assumed a donor unless they opt out, she was quite horrified by that. But then when we had our second interview, she'd spoken to her daughter, who was educated and had a philosophy degree. She completely changed her mind. But it really was a really good demonstration of how actually where a migrant has come from and their life experiences actually shaped her view of organ donation and what might happen to her. My other case I would like to just cite is a lady who was married to a Sri Lankan gentleman who unfortunately in 2020 died after going to Sri Lanka for an illegal kidney transplant. He'd been on the waiting list. He was age 46. He'd been on the waiting list in the UK for 6 years for an organ, and he felt that he was overlooked, that it was ruining his life. And unbeknown to her, he had taken a loan out on their mortgaged house and moved the whole family to Sri Lanka for 6 months whilst he underwent an illegal kidney transplant set up by family members, again, a network of people that she had never met. And he eventually died of a post-operative infection and rejection, leaving her stranded in a country with a large amount of medical bills to pay. And then, you know, this brings it home that these were 6 people, all had a relationship with the organ trade in some way, views or a life's experience. And if you start, I think that is the tip of the iceberg. We don't speak about this enough. This lady actually only started talking about her experiences because she was in debt and was at risk of losing her house. It was only after gentle conversations of how this had come about that this interesting and quite horrific story emerged. Sorry, could we just go back to slide 7 a moment? That's great. So my experiences of my research of interacting with people within our migrant communities, looking at their views, looking at how they access education, how actually a lot of the health literature that is put out there to encourage people to donate is they feel is discriminatory. When we start drawing in consanguineous marriage and the literature that goes around that, because consanguineous marriage has a high prevalence of children with congenital renal failure. You start putting the little bits of the jigsaw puzzle together and then start looking at actually the lived experience of different migrant communities in the UK. You can see, one, how there is a reluctance to interact with organ donation, but 2, how they have this duality with medical care. They're quite often hold beliefs from their traditional ancestry medicine, or they will pop back to countries like India and have treatment in India and in the UK. So they're accessing two different types of medical care and belief systems, and sometimes that leads to organ transplants in illegal settings.
Yeah. So, Jo, are you going to round up now, please, Jo?
Yeah,
So we can go to.
Yeah. So
yeah.
The last slide basically is the organ trade. It has a duality which coexists between legitimate organ donation and harvesting, is interchangeable with medical establishments and organised crime. It's consistent narrative, lack of data, poor knowledge and lessons learned with no actual improvement. There's a move, we need to move from explicit knowledge rather than implicit thinking globally and locally. And biomedicine has a globality that is a Eurocentric language, ways of interpreting the world in exclusion of the other, which really complements and allows the organ trade to prevail. How do we remodel the global health state? How do we tackle as health-assisted fraud and private medical care? And could a non-legislative approach be found in disrupting the supply in organs by addressing health inequality at both ends of the supply chain? And I'd just like to leave you with, during COVID and post-COVID, the organ donation rates have gone up, and the stress with it within the BAM communities accessing medicine has become very prevalent. And what the BMA said about this post-COVID was, responding to the recent Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities inquiry, an understanding of the structural causes of racism, ethnic disparities and systemic biases is essential to addressing them long and short term. We are, however, concerned that the current emphasis is more to seek evidence on ethnic disparities and inequalities in the UK, when such evidence has been in existence for decades. I think that's really key. It really sums up maybe our relationship with the organ trade as well. It's about the other. It's about the movement of organs from the rich, from poor south to rich west countries, and is underpinned by poor healthcare and access to healthcare worldwide.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. It was very interesting you highlighting the race disparities, the ethnic disparities in relation to organ trafficking, organ harvesting, especially within the UK medical and healthcare system. Thank you, Joe. So I know that I said we were going to finish around 1:10, but I just want to give a few people an opportunity to ask any burning questions that they might have. I think all of our speakers are still here. So if you have any key question, please, if you can raise your hand virtually or virtually, because I can't see everyone. If you can raise your hand virtually, please. Then we can take a few questions before. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for coming. If there are no questions, then I would like to say thank you, a big thank you to all our speakers. It's been a very enlightening session. We're going to modify the recording so we can remove the presentation by Iain for many reasons. And then, of course, we'll place the recording on our website. We feel that other people who were not able to join in will have access to it. And of course, we look forward to doing more work around this issue, because it's something that a lot of people are not aware of, especially based on your presentation, Joe, in Black communities, the potential for people to be at risk of having their organs stolen from them, especially because many people in the UK today have links to their countries of origin, and many people, frequently visit. So thank you so much for that. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Godwin. And thank you, Iain. I hope I haven't left anybody out, but thank you everybody for your presentations. Really enjoyed it, and very enlightening, very thought-provoking. And yes, I wish you all the best and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.